Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery's Heritage Manager.
And my name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we are talking about tea. That's the letter T, not tea, but also the drink tea, because that's my first letter. In C, we talked about coffee. So we're working our way through the caffeinated beverages. And historically, quite a lot of similarities between tea and coffee. So, like coffee, the history of tea is deeply entrenched in colonialism, particularly British colonialism. The first record in English relating to tea is a letter written by an East India Company officer, perhaps unsurprisingly, in Japan in 1615. It's not that long, about 40 years before you start seeing tea being sold in Britain. And there is friend of the pod, Samuel Pepys.
Woohoo!
Check out the P episode for more about Pepys. Only about 10 years after that, so we're talking about 1660s, the politician and diarist Samuel Pepys recorded in his diary that, quote, "I did send for a cup of tea, a China drink, of which I have never drank before." So even Pepys is getting in on the act of tea drinking. But tea has, of course, been known for much longer. So it's been drunk in China since around about 2700 BCE. It began as a medicine, but then became just a drink, a sort of refreshing drink rather than purely being drunk for medicinal purposes. So from China, it goes to Japan and then Taiwan, and then once colonial powers, including Britain, get involved, tea is then spread much further. So in Java by the Dutch and in India by the British. I found a source from 1686. It's a British translation of a Chinese source, which lists all the medical benefits of tea drinking. So, it purifies the blood of that which is gross and heavy. It vanquisheth, I struggle with the word vanquisheth. It vanquisheth heavy dreams. It easeth the brain of heavy damps. It easeth and cureth giddiness and pains. It consumes rawness. Don't know what that means. Opens obstructions. I do know what that means. That means it's a laxative. It clears the sight. It vanquisheth superfluous sleep, which is definitely what caffeine does. It drives away dizziness, making one nimble and valiant. Are you a tea drinker, Olivia? Does it make you nimble and valiant?
I am a tea obsessive. In fact, I have a poster on my wall that says a cup of tea solves everything. I mean, there's an argument for it making you valiant. There's the sort of keep calm, carry on use of tea to support British troops.
Apparently that's not a British thing, that's a universal, because yes, nimble and valiant, it encourageth the heart and drives away fear. So that probably goes with the valiance a bit. Strengthens the memory, it sharpens the will and quickens the understanding. I'm a coffee drinker, but I'm starting to feel like maybe I need to be moving on to tea at this point. I don't remember a list like this for coffee.
Let me lure you to the dark side.
So the first advertisements for tea, again, come in quite quickly. This is within Britain. That was the 1660s, and there was one I saw that said, "That excellent and by all physicians approved China drink called tea or tea." I found an 18th century Dutch physician, Cornelius Bontekoe, almost certainly saying that wrong, who wrote a book all about the virtues of tea. And this is quite hard line, I think, but you'll see how you fall on this, Olivia. But he said, I have no scruple in advising people to drink 50 or 100 or 200 cups at a time. I have often drunk as many in a fore or afternoon, and many people with me, of whom not a single one has yet died.
Oh, well, that's a good caveat on the end.
I would have thought just quantities of fluid alone.
Frequent trips to the bathroom.
And you will sort of start seeing as we go through this from the examples that I've given that a lot of the writing about the medical virtues of tea particularly come from British and Dutch physicians. So these are physicians from countries that have a vested financial interest in tea becoming popular and ideally overtaking coffee and so on. So yeah, it's not necessarily a coincidence that a lot of Dutch physicians were saying things like that. So, moving on to more recent times, by the 19th century in England, tea is also being promoted quite heavily by the temperance movement. So initially in the very early days, some people were saying that there is a danger to drinking large quantities of tea. But by the 19th century, really, people are saying it is useful as an alternative, and say especially by people who are advocating a complete ending of alcohol drinking. But you never fully get away from the stigma because you never know what you're supposed to be doing a lot of the time. So there was also people saying that excessive tea drinking by the working classes would lead to physical and moral weakness. So again, it's one of those things where it's fine if you're posh, but if you are poor, then it will do all sorts of terrible things to you. And tea was in such demand that it was sometimes adulterated or counterfeited. People would dye tea, sometimes with quite toxic dyes, to make the leaves look fresher and more appetizing. But you could also buy secondhand tea. So you were knowingly buying used tea. Again, as a sort of, if you were poor, you could buy used tea leaves.
I mean, I know it's this kind of student trick if you're running low on funds to reuse a tea bag occasionally. But knowingly buying used tea sounds bizarre. Is the assumption that it's like posh people's tea that you're buying?
Well, I think so. And actually, another thing that I read was that it was one of the perks of being a maid or a servant was that you would get your household's used tea. So you would be able to take home to your family all the tea that your master or your mistress had used that day. So I think you're right. In that case, you were getting a sort of higher quality of tea, and probably you were hoping that tea hadn't been dyed or adulterated in some way because it was the Lady of the Manor's tea. Again, alongside that, you start getting talk about, in the 18th century and a little bit in the 19th century, what were called tea drunkards. So the idea that you were addicted to and you were getting high on tea. You could even be diagnosed with tea mania. And there were some people in asylums. It feels like people were often put in asylums for some of the most spurious of reasons. And one of those was a thing called tea mania, which was quite nebulous. And it felt like every time they diagnosed someone with it, it was a slightly different range of symptoms. But it was tied in with having a nervous disposition. And particularly if you were a woman, you might have tea mania.
Oh, no. So is someone going to claim that I've got tea mania?
I mean, if you're at a point where you've got a poster on your wall about how great tea is, you may well have tea mania, Olivia.
They're all worse things.
So what's your tea then, Olivia?
I've gone for thyroid, mostly because the couple of things that frequently come up under tea, such as tuberculosis and typhoid, have been talked about extensively on the podcast. But thyroid was new to me, so hopefully an interesting topic. So the thyroid is a small butterfly-shaped gland in the neck that produces hormones which regulate bodily functions including growth, metabolism, heart rate, and body temperature. Thyroid disorders include hyperthyroidism, an overactive thyroid, or excessive production of thyroid hormones, hypothyroidism, an underactive thyroid, where the thyroid doesn't produce enough hormones, thyroid inflammation, thyroiditis, thyroid nodules, and thyroid cancer. The thyroid gland received its modern name in the 1600s when the anatomist Thomas Wharton likened its shape to that of an ancient Greek shield or thios. However, the existence of the gland was known long before that, References to the thyroid gland and its diseases can be seen in the literature of ancient Greece, India, and Egypt. In the 4th century BCE, Hippocrates and Plato provided some of the first accounts of the thyroid gland in Greek medicine, proposing its function as a salivary gland. They concluded that the gland was spongy and responsible for lubricating the respiratory passageways. Galen, on the other hand, argued that the gland was more suited to absorption than secretion and labelled the thyroid as an organ of connection between the heart and the brain. He suggested that the heat of the body travelled through vascular networks and was converted to nerve impulses, which affected the substance of the neck, or the thyroid. Leonardo da Vinci drew the thyroid gland in 1511 during his anatomical studies. Even though he was aware of its exact anatomical structure, he couldn't understand its function and assumed it was created to fill the gap between muscles of the neck and to hold the trachea away from the sternum. Andreas Vesalius also provided an illustration of the thyroid gland in 1543, and Bartholomew Eustachius created copper etchings of the thyroid in the 1560s, but they weren't published until 1714. The thyroid as an organ, that could cover quite a big area. So I'm going to focus on thyroid enlargement, which is more commonly known as goiter, and the development of iodine treatment. I'm going to refer to both agoiter and goiter. So agoiter is a swelling in the neck resulting from an enlarged thyroid gland. Although goiter can be caused by several different factors, the most common cause for goiter is iodine deficiency. References to goiter have been seen in lots of ancient texts, likely because of its extensive prevalence in times when its etiology and possible preventative measures were unknown. Aetius, I think is how you pronounce it, mentioned the use of surgery to treat goiter in the 6th century, believing that it was a hernia of the larynx. But the first record of successful thyroid surgery was in the 10th century, performed by Albucasis, who removed a large goiter from a man under opium sedation. However, throughout the 18th century, many people noticed that the supply of blood to the thyroid was excessive in comparison to other areas of the body. And so the German surgeon Heister noted variations in the occurrence of thyroid enlargement and advised that its treatments should be with ointments rather than surgery, warning of hemorrhage risk. In various regions around the world, particularly in mountainous areas, the prevalence of goiter was linked to iodine deficiency in the diet. Iodine mainly accumulates in the sea and in the topsoil, so goiters were common in areas with repeated flooding or glacial activity which eroded the topsoil. For example, the Alps, the Himalayas, and the Andes had high rates of goiter. In some of these historical contexts, goiters were so prevalent that they became normalized within the culture. For instance, in certain alpine regions, large goiters were sometimes considered a sign of beauty. Conversely, it's also in Germany and Austria that the choker necklaces called Kropfketters became popular in the mid-1800s. Women wore them to hide lumps in their necks caused by goiter or the scars from surgical removal of goiters. Chinese physicians used burnt sponges and seaweeds, which contain iodine, for the treatment of goiter as early as 1600 BCE, and that treatment spread worldwide and was later adopted by ancient Greek physicians. For example, Pliny the Elder referred to epidemics of goiter in the Alps and proposed treatments with burnt seaweed in the 1st century BCE. A bit later on, Chinese physicians of the Tang dynasty were the first to successfully treat patients with goiter by using the iodine-rich thyroid gland of animals in raw, pill, or powdered form. I mean, a pill sounds much more palatable than raw thyroid gland, but
I feel like I could handle powdered more than I could handle raw, yeah.
Yeah. The discovery of iodine's importance in thyroid function and its role in preventing goiter marked a significant breakthrough. French chemist Bernard Courtois discovered iodine in 1811, and in 1896, German chemist Eugene Baumann documented it as the central ingredient in the thyroid gland. He did this by boiling thyroid glands of 1,000 sheep. Baumann's discovery suggested that iodine is important to the function of the thyroid gland, And in 1907, the American pathologist David Marine proved that iodine is necessary for thyroid function. In the early 20th century, key public health initiatives introduced foodstuffs fortified with iodine salts, reducing the prevalence of goiter in previously affected regions. In many countries, iodine was added to table salt, and this increased iodine intake. But in the UK, iodine intake was increased as a result of changes in the dairy farming industry. So in the 1930s, farmers began to add iodine to cattle feed in order to improve cattle health, and disinfectants in the dairy industry also contained iodine. Both of those sources increased the iodine concentration of milk, which kind of coincided with something we have talked about before, that milk consumption was encouraged, particularly in the post-war years. Because goiters were so prevalent in quite a lot of communities, there is an idea that they were included in artistic depictions. It does kind of, I think, fall into the category of that retrospective diagnosis, looking for things that maybe aren't there. But some of the things that I found when I was investigating it, some of the references were to depictions of the Madonna and Child by Lucas Cranach the Elder. It is bizarre because in some of them, Christ Child is like holding on to the neck of the Madonna in an area where there might be a goiter. There's also, in various depictions of Judith and her maidservant, the maidservant is sometimes depicted as having a goiter. But also in nativity figurines as well, like those that were meant to represent everyday people sometimes have these big lumps around the neck that represent goiters. And one which I think possibly is a stretch, but that's a personal view, is the depiction of God on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Because some people have linked the idea that Michelangelo might have put himself into the depiction of God and was probably suffering with issues around thyroid and goiter. Some people think they can see a nodular goiter.
There's a lot of possiblies and maybes in there, though.
It is a debated issue, but interesting nonetheless.
So we're ending with another tea for me, and I am very addiction heavy this time. So we had our tea drinking addiction, and now we're into tobacco. So just to start with a little bit of background. So tobacco is brought to Europe in the 1500s by Spanish following their invasion of the Americas. And with this wave of tobacco into Europe, it very quickly becomes a whole industry surrounding tobacco. So for the well-off, of course, there's all sorts of accoutrements, and it gets very extravagant very quickly. So you have tobacco pipes, but they are made from oak and amber and ivory, and they're encrusted with exotic gems. You would often have a smoking set, so you would have this gem-encrusted pipe, but you would have a matching tinderbox and tamper and tobacco case, so all in this sort of very encrusted, beautiful sort of material. And then the clothing changes as well. So you start getting smoking jackets. You start getting specific clothing that would be worn when you were smoking. And of course, the less well-off have their own accessories as well. So there is a particularly big clay pipe industry in Glasgow for a lot of the 18th and 19th centuries. And this comes really with the fact that colonial goods were coming into Glasgow. So slave-produced material, including tobacco, but also sugar and so on. And so industries grow around that. So you don't only have these goods arriving, but you have all of the sort of accessories being made as well. So pipes from Glasgow were sold all over the world. Another sort of working class accessory that was quite common in the 18th and 19th centuries were brass tobacco tins, and you can often find these in antique shops relatively cheaply. They're either tobacco tins or they are snuff boxes, but most commonly they are tobacco tins. And these were particularly used by miners, and the very nice thing about these, and we've got one in our collections, is they would typically have cut into the cover the name of the miner, the date, and the mine that they worked in, I guess in case they lost it so it could be returned to them. But you often kind of get that little bit of human insight. And they were particularly common for miners because you were not permitted to smoke because smoking in a coal mine was very dangerous. So you would typically chew your tobacco instead, so you would have these special tins for your chewing tobacco. But alongside all of this recreational use of tobacco, there are a lot of physicians who were promoting tobacco as a great medicine. And I mentioned when we talked about tea that the people with a vested interest in the success of the tea industry were usually of the same nation as the people who were talking about how medicinally important it was. It was exactly the same with tobacco. A lot of Spanish physicians were writing about how medically good tobacco was. So one of the first in the 1570s is a Spanish physician called Nicolas Monardes. He described over 65 different diseases which he claimed tobacco could cure, and he talked about how medicinally you should take the tobacco. So sometimes it was smoking, sometimes it was chewing, sometimes it was putting wet leaves of tobacco on your skin, and, sorry to say, but sometimes it was in enema form. You can't get away from it. You can never get away from it. But there were all sorts of things. So if you had pregnancy-related conditions, you were supposed to rub tobacco leaves onto your stomach. You know, all sorts of things. Sticking with the colonial powers theme, in the 1600s, a Dutch physician, Giles Everard, wrote a book called The Universal Medicine, The Wonderful Virtues of Tobacco. And again, they did love their universal medicines, their one medicine to cure them all. And he had a similarly long list, so it could cure plague, flatulence, asthma, syphilis. It could glue together wounds, clean infected sores. And again, a lot of the time you were taking it as an enema.
I was going to ask about that because I remembered, I think it was when we did the episode on lungs, we talked about cigarettes for asthmatics. And I wondered how far back the idea of tobacco being good for your lungs went.
Quite far back. It almost feels like a sort of no pain, no gain or something. Again, we've said this before in other episodes. If something has an effect on something in some way, then it's viewed as medicine. So the fact that you could feel something happening to your lungs almost meant that it was doing something medical in their eyes. You know, it was definitely doing something. So it was probably medical.
Yeah, okay.
Not advocating for that. So again, as I was saying before, you can, when you're talking about tea, you're talking about tobacco, you can't get away from the politics of it all. A lot of the advice that is being given is tied in with national politics and economics and things like that. So having said that, you had someone like King James VI being very vocally anti-smoking. He wrote a book called A Counterblast to Tobacco in 1604. And in this book, King James called it this vile custom of smoking the noxious weed. So he's very, very clear on his stance. But he didn't outlaw tobacco. He introduced a 4,000% tax increase on tobacco products. And in the early 1600s, when he was writing this, tobacco was only grown in regions of Americas that were controlled by Spain. So tobacco was, as far as Europe was concerned, a Spanish product. And once tobacco began to be produced in British-controlled Virginia in 1612, James changes his position. So he's very, very anti-tobacco until the money from tobacco comes to him, and then he changes his stance. He nationalized the British tobacco trade. All income from tobacco sales, so not just taxation, but all income went to his coffers. So there's a lot going on in these Dutch physicians and British kings underlying their stances on the subject of tobacco.
Is there sort of an element of, well, we have lots of it, we might as well use it? I'm just thinking, is that the reason why Dutch fumigation started?
I think there's an element of that. I think, as we said before, something new, it can't not have a purpose, so it might as well be this. But I do think, very, very early on, there are huge vested interests involved. So the Dutch physician Giles Everard that I just mentioned, it's very interesting looking at his book on the virtues of tobacco, because just inside the cover, you find that it's dedicated to the tobacco plantation owners, that they are essentially the sponsors of his work. So it's very, very early that connection between big business and the medical community is made. And so there is investment money and support money to be made by people who fly the flag for big tobacco, even in the 1600s.
Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.